A virgin mountain man waited for his mail-order bride, but when the stagecoach door opened, an obese teen stepped out instead. The dusty street went silent. Then the laughter began. Church bells tolled as townsfolk jeered, mocking the lonely hermit and the trembling girl who had nowhere else to go. But instead of turning away, the mountain man lifted her hand high, declaring before all, "This is my bride." He thought his mercy would end the shame, but danger was already riding fast, because a slick claim agent carried papers that could tear them apart forever. What secret debt bound this girl's fate? How far would one man go to protect a stranger who suddenly became his wife? And in a land where ridicule cuts deeper than bullets, can love and faith prove stronger than the law? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. Through the midday haze, Caleb Boone guided his faithful mule down the winding trail toward Silver Creek. The October sun caught the freshly oiled leather of his saddle, warming his back through his Sunday coat. His weathered hand, scrubbed pink that morning, gripped the reins with unusual tension. Today wasn't like his regular supply runs into town. Today would change everything. The mule's hooves clicked against loose stones as they descended, kicking up small clouds of dust that settled on Caleb's polished boots. He'd spent hours getting ready, trimming his beard close, combing his unruly hair until it lay flat beneath his hat. Even his coat, usually hanging forgotten in the cabin, had been brushed free of moths and pressed as best he could manage. His stomach churned with each step closer to town. After 15 years alone in his mountain cabin, he was finally taking a wife. The thought made his palms sweat, despite the cool morning air. He'd written to the marriage broker 6 months ago requesting a mature widow, someone practical who wouldn't mind his simple ways, someone who could share his quiet life without expecting too much romance from a man who'd never courted. The first buildings of Silver Creek came into view: the general store, the assayer's office, the telegraph station with its spindly antenna reaching toward the clouds. Caleb's throat tightened as he noticed townsfolk already gathering near the stage depot. News traveled fast in small towns, and his impending marriage had been choice gossip for weeks. He dismounted stiffly, boots crunching on packed dirt as he tied his mule to the hitching post. The animal snorted and shook its head, more at ease than its master. Caleb tried to ignore the whispers that followed him as he made his way to the depot's wooden platform. "There's the hermit now," someone muttered, finally crawling down from his mountain. "Reckon any woman desperate enough to answer his ad knows what she's getting into?" Another voice snickered. Caleb's ears burned, but he kept his eyes fixed on the rutted road leading into town. The stage was due any minute. He clutched his hat in both hands, working the brim between calloused fingers. The morning's confidence in his cleaned-up appearance began to fade under the weight of so many stares. Mrs. Henderson, the minister's wife, approached with a sympathetic smile. "Good morning, Mr. Boone. We're all so pleased you're finally taking this step." Her eyes held a mixture of pity and curiosity that made him want to mount up and flee back to his cabin. "Much obliged, ma'am," he managed, voice rough from disuse. Social pleasantries had never been his strong suit. The distant rumble of wooden wheels and thundering hooves drew everyone's attention. Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as the stagecoach appeared through the dust, 4 horses straining against their traces as the driver guided them toward the depot. More townspeople emerged from shops and offices, gathering to witness the arrival of Caleb Boone's mail-order bride. He felt the weight of their expectations like a physical burden. The coach lurched to a stop, brake chains rattling. "Mail and passengers for Silver Creek," the driver called out, securing the reins. Caleb stepped forward, hands trembling slightly as he waited for his first glimpse of the woman who would share his life. The coach door swung open with a creak. Instead of the mature widow he'd expected, a girl barely into womanhood tentatively emerged. She was severely overweight, her faded blue dress straining at the seams. Dark hair escaped from beneath her worn bonnet as she struggled with the high step, clutching a battered carpetbag in one hand and a sealed envelope in the other. The silence that had fallen over the crowd broke into poorly concealed titters and gasps. On the boardwalk, a group of boys openly pointed and snickered. The girl, she couldn't be more than 17, hunched her shoulders as if trying to make herself smaller, her round face flushing deep red. "That's his bride?" someone whispered loudly. "Poor man got swindled proper." "Looks like he ordered 2 wives and 1, another voice jeered. Caleb stood rooted to the spot, a storm of emotions churning inside him. Shock at the girl's youth and size warred with shame at his own disappointment and anger at the cruel remarks. He'd prayed for a companion, dreamed of someone to share his lonely days. Instead, he'd been sent a child, one clearly carrying burdens of her own. The girl's eyes darted around fearfully before settling on him. Recognition flickered across her face as she took in his tall frame and new coat. Her fingers tightened on the carpetbag as she took a hesitant step forward. "Mr. Boone?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, trembling like an autumn leaf about to fall. "Yes, miss." He forced the words past his tight throat, aware of every eye watching their awkward exchange. She held out the sealed envelope. "From Reverend Matthews. He said to give you this straight away." Caleb accepted the letter, noting how her hand shook. Up close, he could see dark circles under her eyes, speaking of sleepless nights and long travel. Whatever circumstances had led her to become a mail-order bride, they hadn't been kind. More snickers erupted from the group of boys. One made an exaggerated waddling motion, sending his friends into fits of laughter. The girl's lower lip trembled as she tried to blink back tears. Something shifted in Caleb's chest. This wasn't what he'd wanted or expected, but the cruelty being directed at this vulnerable young woman struck against everything he believed about Christian charity. Without conscious thought, he stepped between her and the pointing fingers, sheltering her from view. "Miss..." He realized he didn't even know her name. "Lydia," she supplied softly. "Lydia Parker." "Miss Parker, let me take your bag." He gently extracted the carpetbag from her white-knuckled grip. "My mule's just over here. It's a fair ride up to the cabin, but she's steady-footed." Relief flooded her face at this simple kindness, though fear still lingered in her eyes. She followed him away from the crowd, head bowed, each step careful as if she expected the ground itself to reject her weight. Caleb helped her mount, trying not to notice how the mule dipped under the unexpected load. He gathered the reins, deciding to lead the animal on foot. As they started away from the depot, the whispers and laughter followed them like persistent flies. "Reckon the Virgin Hermit's still gonna be one after today. Hope he reinforced his cabin floor." Caleb's jaw clenched, but he kept his eyes forward. Beside him, he heard Lydia's quiet sniff as she fought back tears. The sealed letter from Reverend Matthews burned in his pocket, likely explaining how this match had come to be. But those answers could wait. Right now, his duty was clear. This girl, this Lydia, had been placed in his care, regardless of his expectations or desires. Whatever came next, he wouldn't add to her burden of shame and fear. The good Lord had his reasons for everything, even if they weren't always clear to mortal minds. They left Silver Creek behind, climbing toward the mountains that had been Caleb's only companions for so long. The October wind whispered through yellow aspen leaves, speaking of change and challenges ahead. Neither Caleb nor Lydia spoke as they made their way up the familiar trail, each lost in private thoughts about the unexpected turn their lives had taken. The dust from town settled on their clothes and the mule's flanks, marking the beginning of a journey neither had anticipated. But with each step away from the cruel laughter and pointing fingers, something else settled as well. A quiet determination in Caleb's heart to be worthy of the trust this young woman had placed in him, even if she wasn't the bride he'd imagined. The cruel laughter grew louder, echoing off the weathered buildings of Silver Creek's main street. More townspeople gathered, drawn by the spectacle like vultures to carrion. Caleb's shoulders tensed as he heard the sharp-edged comments slice through the autumn air. "Ain't that just fitting?" Old Tom Wheeler cackled from his perch outside the barbershop. "The Virgin Hermit and the fat girl. Match made in heaven, I reckon." Lydia's hands trembled as she clutched her carpetbag closer, as if it might shield her from the barbed words. Tears welled in her eyes, threatening to spill down her round cheeks. The stage driver, busy unloading mail sacks, merely shrugged when Caleb caught his eye. "Her fare's spent, mister," the driver said flatly. "And that stepfather of hers made no provision for return passage. She's yours now, for better or worse." A group of young men lounging against the saloon's hitching post made exaggerated bowing motions. "All hail Boone's princess," one called out, sending the others into fits of mean-spirited laughter. Something shifted inside Caleb's chest, a feeling both foreign and familiar. The shame that had dogged his steps since boyhood tried to surface, but another emotion rose stronger. Here was this young girl, barely more than a child, being torn apart by the same vicious tongues that had driven him to his solitary life in the mountains. The thought of her facing such cruelty alone stirred something protective in his heart. Before he could second-guess himself, Caleb stepped forward. His large, work-roughened hand found Lydia's soft one. She startled at his touch, looking up at him with wide, uncertain eyes. In one fluid motion, he raised their joined hands high above their heads, his voice ringing out clear and strong across the crowded street. "This here's my bride." The declaration hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Mockery turned to stunned silence as the townsfolk registered the fierce determination in Caleb's normally gentle face. Even the young troublemakers by the saloon fell quiet, caught off guard by this unexpected show of defiance from the shy mountain man. "Come along, Mrs. Boone," Caleb said, loud enough for all to hear. He tucked Lydia's hand into the crook of his arm, positioning himself between her and the crowd. "Let's get you something warm to wear. These mountain evenings can bite fierce." He guided her toward Whitaker's Mercantile, his tall frame effectively shielding her from the worst of the stares and whispers. The bell above the door chimed as they entered the relative sanctuary of the store. Mr. Whitaker looked up from his ledger, curiosity written plain across his weathered features. Once inside, Lydia's composure crumbled slightly. Her hands shook as she withdrew the preacher's letter from her reticule. "Sir," she whispered, "you should read this first. Before you make any declarations you might regret." Caleb accepted the envelope, noting the official seal of Reverend Matthews's church in Kansas City. The paper crackled as he unfolded it, revealing neat, precise handwriting. "Dear Mr. Boone, I write concerning the bearer of this letter, Miss Lydia Parker. Her circumstances are delicate. Her stepfather, Mr. James Harrison, has arranged this match out of what he terms necessity. While I have reservations about the hasty nature of these arrangements, Miss Parker has conducted herself with admirable grace despite difficult circumstances. I pray you will show Christian charity in this matter. Yours in Christ, Reverend Thomas Matthews." Anger flared in Caleb's chest as he read between the lines. Some man had essentially sold his stepdaughter to a stranger, shipping her off like unwanted freight. He looked at Lydia, really seeing her now, the exhaustion in her young face, the way she seemed to expect rejection at any moment. Mr. Whitaker cleared his throat meaningfully, reminding Caleb they weren't alone. "Can I help you folks find anything today?" "Yes," Caleb said, carefully folding the letter away. "My bride needs a proper shawl, something warm for the mountain weather." Lydia's head snapped up, surprise evident in her tear-bright eyes. Despite everything revealed in the letter, he was still claiming her? Mr. Whitaker brought out several shawls, and Caleb selected a thick wool one in deep blue. It was more than he'd planned to spend, but the way Lydia's fingers reverently stroked the soft fabric made it worth every penny. He helped her wrap it around her shoulders, noting how the color brought out subtle highlights in her dark hair. "Thank you," she whispered, the first word she'd spoken directly to him since his declaration outside. The sun was already sliding toward the mountains when they left the Mercantile. The worst of the crowd had dispersed, though a few curious onlookers still watched from shop windows. Caleb helped Lydia into his wagon, making sure she was settled comfortably before climbing up beside her. They left Silver Creek behind, the wagon wheels creaking a steady rhythm as they followed the winding trail into the high country. The aspens were turning golden, their leaves whispering secrets to the cooling evening air. Lydia sat quietly beside him, occasionally dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. The silence between them stretched like a living thing, full of unasked questions and unspoken fears. The last rays of sunlight painted the mountain peaks in shades of pink and purple when Lydia finally broke the silence. "Thank you," she said again, her voice barely louder than the wagon wheels. "No one's ever..." I mean, when you took my hand back there." She trailed off, unable to find words for what his simple act of kindness had meant to her. Caleb kept his eyes on the trail ahead, but he heard everything she couldn't say in those few halting words. "Ain't right," he said gruffly, "treating folks that way. Don't matter what a person looks like or where they come from. Bible says we're all God's children." A fresh tear slid down Lydia's cheek, catching the last light of day. She pulled the blue shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if trying to hold on to the warmth of his unexpected kindness. The wagon continued its steady climb toward Caleb's remote cabin, where an uncertain future waited for them both. He'd chosen mercy over pride, protection over rejection. It wasn't the marriage he'd imagined, but as he glanced at the young woman beside him, he knew he'd made the only choice a God-fearing man could make. Stars were just beginning to pepper the darkening sky when Lydia spoke again, her words barely audible above the creaking wagon. "My stepfather. He said no one would ever want me. That I should be grateful anyone would take me at all." Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "Your stepfather was wrong about a lot of things, Miss Lydia. Reckon that's just one more to add to the list." She didn't respond, but he noticed her shoulders relax slightly, as if some heavy burden had begun to lift. They continued their journey into the gathering dusk, two lonely souls brought together by circumstances neither had expected, both choosing to believe that God's mercy might be found even in life's darker moments. Night had fallen completely by the time the wagon crested the final ridge. Stars pierced the velvet darkness overhead, and a chill wind whispered through the towering pines. Lydia huddled deeper into her new shawl, trying to make out shapes in the darkness. The wagon wheels crunched over pine needles as Caleb guided them onto a narrow track between the trees. "Almost there," he said softly, his first words in over an hour. A few moments later, a clearing opened before them. Lydia could just make out the dark bulk of a cabin against the star-filled sky. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down, his boots crunching in the dried leaves. He moved with practiced ease in the darkness, helping her down from the wagon with gentle hands. "Wait here," he murmured, and she heard his footsteps on wooden steps, followed by the scratch of a match. Golden light suddenly spilled from a window, and Lydia got her first real look at her new home. The cabin was sturdy but simple, built of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end. A small covered porch protected the front door, and neat stacks of firewood lined one wall. It wasn't grand, but something about its solitary presence in the wilderness spoke of care and dedication. Caleb appeared in the doorway holding a lit lantern. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. "Watch your step there." Lydia entered slowly, her carpet bag clutched tight against her chest. The lantern light revealed a single room, neat as a pin despite its rustic nature. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold now but well swept. A narrow cot with a patchwork quilt stood in one corner, while a solid wooden table with two chairs occupied the center of the room. Simple shelves lined the walls, holding an array of dried goods, tools, and a few books. She stood awkwardly just inside the door, suddenly very aware of how much space she took up in the small room. I don't want to be in your way." Caleb shook his head as he moved to the hearth. "You ain't in the way." He knelt to lay a fire, his movements quick and practiced. Been meaning to build on another room come spring anyway. Within minutes, a cheerful blaze crackled in the fireplace, pushing back the mountain chill. Caleb hung a pot of beans over the flames and pulled cornmeal and other supplies from the shelves. Lydia watched him work, wanting to help but unsure of her place in this strange new world. Would you like me to do anything?" she asked hesitantly. He glanced up from where he was mixing cornbread batter. "You've had a long journey. Rest a spell. There's water in that pitcher if you're thirsty." Lydia perched carefully on one of the wooden chairs, her hands folded in her lap. The chair creaked slightly under her weight, and she flushed with embarrassment. But Caleb didn't seem to notice, focused on his cooking with quiet competence. Soon, savory smells filled the cabin. Caleb served up 2 bowls of beans and thick slices of hot cornbread, setting one before Lydia with careful courtesy. She ate slowly, though her stomach growled at the simple but satisfying food. When she accidentally dropped a few beans, leaving spots on the clean table, tears sprang to her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm too much trouble. I know I'm not what you were expecting." Caleb looked up from his own meal, his expression serious in the firelight. "Miss Lydia, you don't need to keep apologizing. Ain't right what folks did to you today. Ain't right what your stepfather did neither. You deserve kindness same as anyone." His words, spoken with such simple conviction, made fresh tears spill down her cheeks. She dabbed at them with her handkerchief, noticing how Caleb looked away to give her privacy with her emotions. After they finished eating, Lydia found herself drawn to explore the cabin more closely, seeking clues about the man she'd been sent to marry. The firelight revealed a well-worn Bible on a shelf near the cot, its leather cover soft with use. A rifle hung on pegs above the door, its stock polished by careful hands. But as she looked around, she noticed something odd. There were no feminine touches anywhere. No quilts besides the one on the cot, no curtains, no pretty bits of china or keepsakes. "Mr. Boone," she said softly, "may I ask, what happened to your wife? The one before, I mean." She steeled herself for tales of death or abandonment, wondering what tragedy had left him alone in these mountains. Caleb was silent for a long moment, standing by the fire with his back to her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough with emotion. "Never had one. Never had any wife at all." Lydia blinked in surprise. But you must be near 40 years old. 38 come winter." He turned to face her, his expression a mix of shame and defiance. "Been alone all my life. Waiting, I reckon. Waiting to do things proper, according to God's word." The meaning of his words slowly sank in. He wasn't a widower or a man abandoned. He was like her, untouched, unwanted, alone. The revelation stole her breath for a moment. The townsfolk's mockery of the virgin hermit took on new meaning, as did his fierce defense of her at the stagecoach stop. She whispered, "I've never been wanted either." The silence that fell between them was heavy with understanding, broken only by the pop and crackle of the fire. Caleb moved about the cabin, laying out a bedroll near the door while Lydia stood frozen by this new awareness of him. "You take the cot," he said finally, his voice gruff with awkwardness. "I'll sleep here by the door. Safer that way, case of bears or such." Lydia nodded, clutching her carpet bag as she moved toward the cot. She pulled out her nightgown but then stood uncertainly, looking around the one-room cabin. Understanding her dilemma, Caleb immediately turned his back. "I won't look," he promised. "You get changed and settled. I'll bank the fire after." She changed quickly, the cold mountain air raising goosebumps on her skin. The cot creaked as she lay down, pulling the patchwork quilt up to her chin. She heard Caleb moving about, tending to the fire, then the rustle of him settling onto his bedroll. "Good night, Miss Lydia," he said softly. "Good night, Mr. Boone," she whispered back. In the darkness, Lydia lay awake, listening to the strange night sounds of the mountain wilderness. The cry of an owl, the whisper of wind in the pines, the settling of log walls cooling after the day's heat. She thought about the man lying across the room who had lived alone up here all these years, waiting for something pure and proper. Instead, he'd been sent her, young, unwanted, too large, too much of everything wrong. Yet he had claimed her publicly, defended her honor, shown her nothing but kindness. Tears slid silently down her cheeks as she offered up a prayer, asking God to help her be worthy of such unexpected mercy. On his bedroll, Caleb too lay awake, his own prayers rising silently in the darkness. He asked for guidance, for wisdom, for the strength to be the protector this young woman needed. Neither knew what tomorrow would bring, but in the quiet of that mountain night, something fragile and new had begun to take root between them, a shared understanding born of mutual loneliness and unexpected grace. The morning arrived crisp and clear, with frost painting delicate patterns across the meadow grass. Dawn's pale light found Caleb already up and moving quietly around the cabin, trying not to wake Lydia as he kindled the morning fire. The familiar routine felt different now, weighted with new responsibility. Outside, his breath clouded in the cold mountain air as he surveyed the woodpile. Winter wasn't far off, and they'd need more split logs to keep the cabin warm. He grabbed his axe and set to work, the rhythmic thud of steel against wood echoing across the clearing. A creak of hinges made him pause. Lydia stood in the doorway, wrapped in her shawl against the morning chill. She'd tried to smooth her hair and straighten her faded dress, but uncertainty showed in every line of her body. "Good morning, Mr. Boone," she said softly, watching him work. Caleb nodded, suddenly conscious of his sweaty shirt and uncombed hair. "Morning, Miss Lydia. Sleep well?" "Yes, thank you." She stepped out onto the rough-hewn porch, her eyes following his movements as he swung the axe. Could I help somehow?" Caleb hesitated, seeing her eager expression. "This here's heavy work," he said carefully. "Don't want you straining yourself." But Lydia's chin lifted slightly. "Please, I want to be useful. I can learn." Something in her quiet determination touched him. He beckoned her over, showing her how to stack the split logs. When she tried to lift too many at once and stumbled, he steadied her gently. "No shame in taking smaller loads," he said. "Work gets done either way." Lydia's cheeks flushed, but she nodded, adjusting her approach. Soon they fell into a rhythm, Caleb splitting, Lydia stacking. When she'd mastered that, he showed her how to gather kindling, explaining which sizes burned best. "See here," he demonstrated, breaking smaller branches to manageable lengths. "These little ones catch quick. Help the bigger pieces take." Lydia's fingers proved nimble at the task, though she moved carefully, conscious of her size. When she'd collected a good bundle, Caleb showed her the path to the spring. "Water's fresh and sweet," he said, handing her a bucket. "Watch your step on them rocks, though. They get slippery." The path wasn't long, but it wound down a steep slope. Lydia picked her way carefully, pausing to catch her breath. The bucket was awkward when full, sloshing water on her skirts, but she managed to carry it back without falling. "Well done," Caleb said simply, and her face lit up at the praise. Next came feeding the mule, a creature nearly as tall as Lydia herself. She approached cautiously, but the animal proved gentle, accepting hay from her hand with soft lips. "He likes you," Caleb observed, watching them. "Got good sense, that mule." Lydia stroked the animal's nose, pleasure replacing fear in her expression. "What's his name?" "Moses," Caleb replied, then added with a hint of humor. "On account of him being stubborn as sin sometimes." A tiny giggle escaped Lydia, surprising them both. She covered her mouth quickly, but Caleb's eyes had crinkled at the corners, showing he didn't mind. Back in the cabin, Lydia insisted on making breakfast. Her hands moved surely as she mixed biscuit dough, sliding the pan into the Dutch oven with practiced ease. Soon, savory smells filled the small space. When she placed a plate before Caleb, he bit into a biscuit and nodded approvingly. "These are right fine, Miss Lydia. Been a long time since I had proper baking." Color rose in her cheeks at the compliment. "Mama taught me before she passed. Said every woman should know how to make good biscuits." "She taught you well," Caleb said, reaching for another. After breakfast, Caleb mentioned needing to check his trap lines. Lydia looked up hopefully from where she was washing dishes. Would it be all right if I came along? I've never seen real traps before." Caleb considered the rough terrain, but her eagerness was plain. "Trail's not easy," he warned. "I can manage," she said firmly. "Please?" He nodded slowly. "Best put on your sturdiest shoes, then." The forest welcomed them with cathedral silence, broken only by birdsong and the whisper of wind in the pines. Lydia walked carefully but steadily, pausing often to marvel at things Caleb had long taken for granted. The perfect spiral of a snail shell, delicate mushrooms sprouting from fallen logs, a family of deer tracks pressed into mud. "Look how the little one's prints follow the mother's," she whispered, crouching to study them despite her dress pulling tight. Caleb found himself seeing the familiar woods through new eyes, pointing out things he thought might interest her, A hawk's nest high in a dead pine, the scratch marks where a bear had clawed a tree, the flash of a brook trout in the cold stream. They checked several snares, finding 2 empty but one with a plump rabbit. Caleb dispatched it quickly and humanely, explaining how the fur would be useful come winter. Lydia listened intently, asking thoughtful questions that showed she was truly trying to learn. The morning had warmed considerably by the time they turned back toward the cabin. Lydia's face was flushed from exertion, but bright with accomplishment at having managed the whole circuit. However, their peaceful mood shattered at the sight of an unfamiliar horse tied near the cabin. A well-dressed man stood on their porch, his posture radiating impatience. Caleb felt Lydia stiffen beside him. "Stay here," he murmured, but she shook her head, gripping his sleeve as they approached together. The stranger turned at their footsteps, revealing a smooth-shaven face and expensive suit that seemed out of place in the mountain wilderness. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, there you are," he said, pulling papers from his coat. "Mr. Boone, I presume? I'm Mr. Dillard, representing the railroad's interests in these parts." Caleb nodded cautiously, conscious of Lydia's trembling grip on his arm. "I have some rather unfortunate business to discuss," Dillard continued, his tone falsely sympathetic. "It seems Miss Parker's stepfather has defaulted on certain debts. Substantial debts, I'm afraid, which he secured with a rather unusual form of collateral." He held out a document. Caleb took it with his free hand, struggling to make sense of the legal language. "In simple terms," Dillard explained, watching their faces, "the girl was pledged as a bondservant to cover the debt, unless, of course, you can prove a prior legal claim through a lawful marriage." Caleb's heart sank. They had no marriage certificate, no proof beyond his public declaration at the stage stop. He felt Lydia's fingers dig deeper into his sleeve. "Now I'm a reasonable man," Dillard continued smoothly. "I'll give you some time to produce the necessary documentation, but I will return soon to collect either proof of marriage or the girl herself. The law is quite clear on these matters." "She ain't property to be traded," Caleb said, his voice rough with anger. Dillard's smile turned cold. "The law says otherwise, Mr. Boone. I suggest you find those marriage papers quickly." He mounted his horse with practiced ease. "Good day to you both. I'll be seeing you again very soon." They watched him ride away, Lydia pressed against Caleb's side like a frightened deer. Only when the rider disappeared among the trees did she speak, her voice barely a whisper. "Please don't let him take me," she pleaded. "Please, Mr. Boone. I'll work harder. I'll learn everything. I'll—" "Hush now," Caleb cut her off gently, turning to face her. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears threatening to spill. "Ain't nobody taking you anywhere. We'll figure something out." But his own heart was heavy with worry as he led her back into the cabin. The morning's peace had shattered, leaving them both aware of how fragile their arrangement truly was. Lydia's hands shook as she clutched his sleeve, seeking protection from a threat neither had seen coming. The evening sun painted long shadows across the cabin floor as Caleb and Lydia sat in troubled silence. The fire crackled in the hearth, but its warmth did little to ease their worries. Lydia perched on the edge of her chair, hands twisted in her lap while Caleb stared into the flames. "Miss Lydia," he finally said, his voice rough with regret, "I need to tell you something." He shifted uncomfortably, hat crumpled between his calloused hands. "I never filed no marriage license. Figured to settle those details proper once my bride arrived." Lydia's face went pale. Then there's nothing stopping him from taking me?" Her voice quavered like a frightened bird's. "Now hold on," Caleb said, leaning forward. "I made a promise when I claimed you as my bride, and I aim to keep it." His eyes met hers, steady and determined. "Even if the law's got its loopholes, I won't let them drag you away like some piece of property." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes. "But how?" Mr. Dillard seemed so sure. "We'll ride to town first thing tomorrow," Caleb declared. "See Reverend Pike and set things right and proper." He noticed her trembling hands and added softly, "I know it ain't much, but you have my word. I'll protect you." Lydia nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. "Thank you, Mr. Boone." "Best get some sleep," he said gently. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Dawn broke clear and cold the next morning. Caleb loaded the wagon while Lydia packed provisions, bread, cheese, and dried meat wrapped carefully in clean cloth. Her movements were quick and efficient, despite her obvious nervousness. The wagon creaked as they set out, wheels finding every rut in the rough mountain trail. Lydia gripped the seat tightly, trying not to wince at each jolt and bump. Caleb noticed her discomfort, but said nothing, respecting her determination to endure. "Would you like to learn how to handle the reins?" he offered after a while, hoping to distract her from both the uncomfortable ride and her fears. Lydia looked startled. "Me? But I've never—" "Moses here is steady as they come," Caleb assured her. "Just needs a firm hand and clear direction." He showed her how to hold the reins, explaining the subtle pulls and signals that guided the mule. Lydia listened intently, her face screwed up in concentration as she tried to remember everything. "Like this?" she asked, mimicking his grip. "That's right," he nodded. "Now give him a little slack, just so. He knows the trail better than most." They passed several settlers along the way, some hauling supplies, others working their claims. A few nodded in greeting, but others stopped to stare and whisper. Lydia heard fragments that made her cheeks burn, virgin hermit and fat child bride carrying clearly on the morning air. Caleb kept his eyes forward, jaws set, but his hands tightened on the reins. He spoke louder than necessary about Moses's good points, drowning out the cruel whispers with lessons on mule handling. By midday, the sun beat down fierce enough to warrant a rest. Caleb chose a spot near a stream, helping Lydia down from the wagon. She stumbled slightly, legs stiff from the journey, but caught herself quickly. "Reckon we could both use some dinner," Caleb said, unhitching Moses to graze. Lydia brightened at the chance to be useful. "I could bake some bread on the coals," she offered. "Mama taught me how." Caleb raised his eyebrows but helped her gather dry wood. Lydia worked with quiet confidence, mixing flour and water in a pan, then nestling the dough in hot ashes she'd carefully prepared. While it baked, she tended the fire with practiced care. The bread came out golden brown and crusty. Caleb took a bite and nodded appreciatively. "You've got a real gift there, Miss Lydia." She ducked her head, pleased. "It's better in a proper oven, but Mama said a good cook can make do anywhere." "Your mama taught you well," Caleb said softly, watching as she wrapped the leftover bread for later. They reached town as evening shadows lengthened. The streets were quieter now, most businesses closed for the day. Caleb drove straight to the small white parsonage beside the church, where a lamp still burned in the window. Reverend Pike answered their knock promptly, his grave face suggesting he'd expected them. "Come in," he said, ushering them into his study. "I've been praying you'd arrive soon." The room smelled of leather-bound books and lamp oil. Lydia perched nervously on the edge of a straight-backed chair while Caleb remained standing, hat in hand. "I received word about Mr. Dillard's visit," the preacher said, moving to his desk. "Fortunately, I kept copies of all the correspondence regarding your match." He produced a stack of letters, spreading them carefully. These show the arrangement was made in good faith with proper intentions on both sides. Hope flickered in Lydia's eyes, but the Reverend's next words dimmed it. "However," he continued heavily, "while these letters prove the match was legitimate, they may not satisfy the legal requirements. A judge will want to see a proper marriage license issued by the territory." "Can't you just write out something saying we're married?" Caleb asked, frustration evident in his voice. Reverend Pike shook his head. "I could perform a ceremony, yes, but without the license it wouldn't hold up in court. And from what I hear of Mr. Dillard, he'll insist on the full weight of the law." Lydia's hands trembled in her lap. "What can we do?" The preacher gathered the letters carefully. "First thing tomorrow, we'll go to Judge Hammond's office and present our case. These letters, plus my personal testimony about the arrangement's legitimacy, might persuade him to issue a license despite the unusual circumstances." "And if he won't?" Caleb's voice was quiet but intense. "Then we'll need to find another way," Reverend Pike said firmly. "I won't see this child handed over to settle a debt, law or no law." He turned to Lydia, his expression gentle. "You can stay here tonight, my dear. Mrs. Pike will make up the spare room." "Thank you, Reverend," Lydia whispered, her eyes brimming with grateful tears. "Mr. Boone," the preacher continued, "the stable behind the church has room for your wagon and mule. You're welcome to bed down there." Caleb nodded his thanks, then turned to Lydia. "I'll be close by if you need anything. Try to rest easy." As Mrs. Pike led Lydia upstairs, Reverend Pike gathered the letters into a neat packet. "We'll meet here at first light," he told Caleb. "Best come prepared for a fight, brother. Something tells me tomorrow won't be simple." "Ain't nothing been simple since that stage rolled in," Caleb admitted. "But I made her a promise, Reverend. I aim to keep it." "I believe you will," the preacher said softly. "I believe you will." Dawn broke over the town with streaks of pink and gold painting the sky. Caleb stood before the mirror in Reverend Pike's washroom, straightening his string tie with trembling fingers. His reflection showed a man both determined and afraid, clean-shaven but with worry lines etched deep around his mouth. In the parlor, Lydia sat perfectly still in her best dress, a faded blue cotton that Mrs. Pike had hurriedly altered the night before. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. "Remember," Reverend Pike coached them both, "speak clearly and truthfully. Judge Hammond is stern but fair. He'll want to hear the facts plainly stated." The courthouse bell tolled 8 o'clock as they crossed the town square. Already a crowd had gathered, drawn by gossip about the Virgin Mountain Man and his questionable bride. Whispers followed them up the wooden steps. Inside, the courtroom smelled of pine soap and leather. Morning light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. The wooden benches creaked as townsfolk filed in, their Sunday best rustling with each movement. Mr. Dillard stood near the judge's desk, immaculate in his tailored suit. His smile carried all the warmth of a rattlesnake's warning. Scattered papers lay before him, arranged with precise care. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Hammond entered. He was a tall man with iron-gray hair and eyes that seemed to measure every soul before him. His black robes whispered against the floor as he took his seat. "Case of Dillard versus Boone," the bailiff announced, "regarding the status of one Lydia Parker." The judge peered over his spectacles. "Mr. Dillard, you may present your claim." Dillard stepped forward smoothly. "Your Honor, I represent the Western Railroad Trust, which holds valid liens against the estate of George Parker, stepfather to the girl Lydia. When Parker defaulted on his debts, all his property and dependents became subject to collection. He produced a document with a flourish, including his unmarried minor daughter." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Hammond's expression remained unchanged. "And your interest in this matter?" "As the trust's agent, I am here to collect on their behalf." Dillard's voice dripped with false concern. "The girl was improperly removed from her home and is now living in questionable circumstances with an unmarried man." More whispers filled the room. Lydia's cheeks flamed red, but she kept her chin up. "Mr. Boone," the judge intoned, "what say you to these charges?" Caleb stood, his hat crushed between his hands. "Your Honor, I sent for a mail-order bride, proper and legal-like. Got letters to prove it." His voice shook slightly, but grew stronger as he continued. "When Miss Lydia arrived, I claimed her as my bride before witnesses. Been treating her with nothing but respect since." "Yet you filed no marriage license," the judge noted. "Why?" Caleb swallowed hard. "I meant to set everything right once she arrived. Didn't expect complications." "Complications indeed," Dillard cut in smoothly. "The girl is clearly underage and unfit to consent to marriage. This mountain man's claims are worthless." "If I may, Your Honor," Reverend Pike spoke up, rising from his seat. "I have here the original correspondence regarding this match." He approached the bench with his packet of letters. "Everything was arranged openly and honestly between all parties." The judge accepted the papers, examining them carefully while the courtroom held its breath. Finally, he looked up. "Miss Parker, approach the bench." Lydia rose on trembling legs. Her steps were unsteady as she made her way forward, but her voice came out clear and steady. "Yes, Your Honor." "How old are you, child?" 17 years, Your Honor. I'll be 18 come harvest time." "And did you come here of your own will?" Lydia's hands twisted in her skirts. My stepfather arranged it, sir, but Mr. Boone ... She glanced back at Caleb, drawing strength from his steady gaze. Mr. Boone has treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. He protected me when others would have left me to shame. Judge Hammond studied her face. Has he made any improper advances? No, sir. Lydia's cheeks flamed again. He's been a perfect gentleman. Sleeps by the door while I take the bed. Never so much as... That's enough. The judge held up his hand. Mr. Dillard, your response? Dillard stepped forward eagerly. Your Honor, the girl's age makes her testimony suspect. She's clearly been influenced by this man's false promises. The fact remains, she is legally bound by her stepfather's debts until she reaches majority. She's 17, Caleb protested, his voice rising. Near enough grown to make her own choice. No law's been broken here. Order, the judge commanded, tapping his gavel. The room fell silent. For long moments, Judge Hammond studied the papers before him. The only sound was the tick of the courthouse clock and the rustle of nervous movement from the gallery. Finally, he spoke. This case presents several complex issues of law and morality. While 17 is indeed near the age of majority, proper procedures must be followed. He fixed Caleb with a stern look. You should have filed for a license immediately upon claiming this girl as your bride. Yes, Your Honor, Caleb mumbled, shoulders slumping. However, the judge continued, I'm also concerned about Mr. Dillard's claim. The practice of binding minors for debt is questionable at best. He shuffled the papers on his desk. Therefore, I will defer ruling for 3 weeks. Relief and anxiety warred on Lydia's face. Caleb stepped forward. Your Honor? During this time, Mr. Boone, you will obtain proof of Miss Parker's age, a birth record or sworn testimony from those who knew her mother. You will also properly file for a marriage license. The judge's gaze swept the room. If these conditions are met, and no other impediments arise, I will consider validating your union. Dillard's smirk faltered. But, Your Honor? However, Judge Hammond raised his voice slightly, if these requirements are not met within 3 weeks' time, Miss Parker will be declared a ward of the court and subject to Mr. Dillard's claim. His gavel cracked against the desk. Court is adjourned. The crowd buzzed with excitement as they filed out. Caleb stood rooted in place until Reverend Pike touched his arm. Come, the preacher said quietly. We have work to do. Outside, the morning had warmed considerably, but Lydia shivered as they descended the courthouse steps. Dillard brushed past them, pausing just long enough to tip his hat mockingly. 3 weeks, he said smoothly. Tick-tock, mountain man? Caleb's fists clenched, but Reverend Pike held him back with a warning touch. They watched Dillard stroll away, his boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. What do we do now? Lydia whispered, her earlier courage crumbling into fear. Caleb turned to her, his expression gentle despite his own worry. First, we get you home safe. Then we start gathering what the judge wants. Proof of your age, proper papers, whatever it takes. But my birth record, Lydia's voice caught. Mama kept it, but after she died, my stepfather, I don't know where anything is anymore. Then we'll find someone who knew your mama, Caleb said firmly. Someone who can swear to when you were born. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. I made you a promise, Miss Lydia. I aim to keep it. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them lost in thought as the wagon creaked along the familiar trail. The sun was setting by the time they reached home, painting the mountains in deep purple shadows. Moses whickered tiredly as Caleb unhitched him. Inside, Lydia moved automatically to light the lamp and stoke the fire. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, betraying her exhaustion. You should rest, Caleb said softly. Been a long day. She turned to him, eyes bright with unshed tears. What if we can't find anyone who knew Mama? What if Mr. Dillard... Now don't you fret about that, snake, Caleb interrupted. We've got 3 weeks. That's time enough to figure something out. He tried to sound more confident than he felt. The Lord didn't bring you here just to let that railroad man drag you away. Lydia managed a weak smile. You really believe that? I do. Caleb nodded firmly. Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we start fresh. As Lydia settled onto her cot, Caleb took his usual place by the door. The cabin fell quiet, except for the pop and crackle of the fire. Outside, a whippoorwill called lonely in the gathering dark. They both lay awake long into the night, each clinging to their fragile hope, each praying for strength to face whatever the next 3 weeks might bring. The morning after their return from town, Caleb rose early and found Lydia already at the hearth, stirring a pot of porridge. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's lone window, catching dust motes in its golden beam. The familiar scent of wood smoke and coffee filled the air. Reckon it's time you learned to handle a rifle, Caleb said after they'd finished breakfast. Can't have you here alone without protection. Lydia's eyes widened. Me with a gun? She wrung her hands in her apron. I've never... No better time to learn. Caleb lifted his Winchester from its pegs above the door. Every frontier woman should know how. Outside, the spring air held a bite of lingering winter. Caleb positioned an old log against the hillside for a target, then showed Lydia how to hold the rifle properly. She struggled with its weight at first, her arms trembling. Here now, Caleb said, gently adjusting her grip. Stock tight against your shoulder like this. His hands were careful, respectful as he guided her. Sight down the barrel at that knot in the wood. Lydia's breath came quick and shallow. What if I miss? Then you try again. Caleb stepped back. Take your time. Squeeze the trigger slow and steady. For several long moments, Lydia stood frozen, the rifle wavering. Then she drew a deep breath and pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the clearing, startling birds from the trees. A chunk of bark flew from the log just inches from the knot. I hit it. Lydia lowered the rifle, her face glowing. I really hit it. Sure did. Caleb couldn't help smiling at her enthusiasm. Want to try again? They spent an hour practicing, Lydia's confidence growing with each shot. By the end, she was hitting the target more often than not. Caleb found himself impressed by her determination. You're a natural, he told her as they walked back to the cabin. Quick learner, too. Lydia ducked her head, but he caught her pleased smile. It struck him how rarely she'd probably heard praise in her life. The days that followed settled into a steady rhythm of work. Spring was coming on fast, and the homestead needed attention after the long winter. Caleb showed Lydia how to mend the split rail fences, replacing rotted posts and straightening those the snow had pushed askew. Despite her size, Lydia proved surprisingly strong and willing. She hauled rails without complaint, though her face grew red with exertion. When Caleb suggested she rest, she shook her head. I want to help, she insisted. I want to be useful. They planted potatoes in the small cleared field behind the cabin, Caleb turning the soil while Lydia dropped seed pieces into the furrows. Her hands were gentle with the earth, patting each piece into place with care. My mama had a garden, she said softly. Used to love helping her tend it before... She trailed off, lost in memory. Caleb waited, letting her find her own words. After she died, my stepfather said I ate too much to waste time growing things. Lydia's voice held old pain. Said I should earn my keep instead. Man was a fool, Caleb said quietly. Garden's going to thrive with your touch. Water was a constant need, and they fell into a routine of hauling it together from the creek. Caleb noticed how Lydia never complained about the weight of the buckets, though they made her breathing heavy. She'd pause sometimes, watching the water sparkle in the morning light, or listening to birds call in the trees. One afternoon, as they worked in companionable silence, Caleb found his gaze drawn to her more and more. She'd tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and wisps had escaped to curl around her face. There was a grace to her movements he hadn't noticed before, a quiet dignity in how she carried herself despite her size. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they sat by the fire. Lydia had taken to mending Caleb's clothes without being asked, her neat stitches replacing his clumsy ones. Never known kindness from men before, she said suddenly, her eyes on her work. My stepfather. She swallowed hard. He called me useless, said I was just another mouth to feed, taking up too much space. Caleb's hands clenched. You're anything but useless, he said firmly. Don't let anyone tell you different. Lydia looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You truly believe that? Wouldn't say it if I didn't. Caleb held her gaze. You've worked harder than any hired hand I've known. Smart, too. Learning everything quick as you do. A blush rose in Lydia's cheeks, but she didn't look away. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing more in me than what shows on the outside. Later, as they prepared for bed, Lydia knelt by her cot. Her voice was soft but clear as she prayed. Dear Lord, thank you for bringing me to this place. Thank you for safety and for... She hesitated. For showing me what kindness looks like. Amen. Caleb lay on his mat by the door, listening to her steady breathing in the darkness. Something stirred in his chest, warmer than obligation, deeper than duty. The feeling both drew and frightened him. He'd lived so long avoiding the temptations of the flesh, keeping his thoughts pure and his distance safe. But watching Lydia's quiet strength, her gentle spirit blooming under simple kindness, it touched places in his heart he'd thought long closed. Still, fear kept him silent. Better to guard his tongue than risk spoiling what peace they'd found. The fire settled with a soft crackle. Outside, a nightbird called, lonely in the darkness. Caleb turned on his side, away from the sound of Lydia's breathing, and tried to still his thoughts with prayer. But even as he drifted toward sleep, his heart knew it was already too late for caution. Something was growing between them, as steady and natural as the spring taking hold outside. Whether he was ready or not, love was finding its way past his careful defenses. The last thing he saw before sleep took him was Lydia's face, glowing with pride as she held his rifle, proving herself stronger than anyone had ever given her credit for being. The warmth of spring crept across the mountain valley, melting snow from shadowed hollows and waking dormant life. Streams that had run quiet beneath ice now swelled with snowmelt, their waters rushing down from higher peaks to flood the meadow creeks. The sound of running water filled the air, mingling with birdsong and the rustle of new leaves. Caleb stood at the edge of his garden plot, surveying the thawed earth. The winter-hardened ground had softened enough to work, rich and dark with promise. He'd been thinking about expansion, eyeing the unused space beyond his original fence line. Lydia, he called toward the cabin, mind helping me out here? She appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning sun caught her hair, turning the brown strands to honey gold. I was thinking we might make the garden bigger, Caleb explained, gesturing to the unclaimed ground. Got extra seeds from trading last fall. Seems a shame not to use them. Lydia's face brightened. Really? You'd want my help? Can't think of anyone better. Caleb handed her a hoe. Reckon between us we can get it done before sundown. They worked steadily through the morning, breaking new ground and turning soil. Caleb showed Lydia how to test the earth's readiness, taking a handful and squeezing it into a ball. If it holds shape but crumbles easy, it's right for planting, he explained. Too wet and it'll just make mud. As if to prove his point, Lydia's next strike with the hoe sent a splash of mud across her face. She froze, startled, then burst into laughter, a clear, bright sound that echoed across the yard. Caleb straightened, struck by the joy in it. In all their weeks together, he'd never heard her laugh like that, free and unguarded. The sound stirred something in his chest, warm and unexpected. Got yourself a new look there, he teased gently, pointing to the mud streak on her cheek. Lydia grinned, not bothering to wipe it away. Reckon I do. She affected an exaggerated formal tone. Is it becoming? Most fetching mud I've ever seen, Caleb replied, surprising himself with the playfulness in his voice. They continued working, but the mood had shifted, lighter somehow. As they prepared the rouse, they found themselves trading small jokes and observations. Lydia told stories about her mother's garden, memories she'd kept tucked away now flowing freely. Mama always said to plant corn, beans, and squash together, she explained, creating shallow furrows in the fresh-turned earth. Called them the three sisters. Said the corn holds up the beans feed the soil, and the squash shades the ground to keep in moisture. Caleb nodded, impressed. Your mama was wise in the ways of growing things. She'd have liked this place, Lydia said softly. All this good earth, just waiting to give life. They worked until late afternoon, planting row after row. Caleb watched as Lydia carefully placed each seed, murmuring quiet blessings over them. Her touch was gentle but sure, treating each one as precious. When the sun began to sink toward the mountains, they stood back to admire their work. The expanded garden stretched neat and promising before them, newly turned earth dark against the greening grass beyond. Beautiful, Lydia breathed, and Caleb found himself watching her face instead of the garden, seeing how her eyes shone with satisfaction. Sure is, he agreed softly, meaning more than just the planted ground. Inside the cabin, Lydia set about preparing supper while Caleb cleaned up from their day's work. The familiar sounds of her moving about the kitchen, the clatter of pots, the scrape of vegetables being chopped, had become a comfort to him, making the cabin feel more like home than it ever had in his years of solitude. She'd started a hearty stew earlier that morning, letting it simmer all day while they worked. Now the rich aroma filled the small space, making Caleb's stomach growl appreciatively. They ate by lamplight, the golden glow casting warm shadows on the walls. Neither felt the need to fill the silence with words. Their shared work had created an easy companionship that needed no explanation. As Lydia cleared away the bowls, she began to hum softly, an old hymn Caleb recognized from his childhood. Without thinking, he joined in, his deeper voice harmonizing with her lighter one. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. Their voices weren't perfect, but they blended with sincere feeling, filling the cabin with simple praise. When the verse ended, Lydia smiled shyly over her shoulder at him. You sing nice, she said. Not as nice as you. Caleb stood, moved by something he couldn't name. He crossed to where she stood at the washing basin. Lydia turned to face him, her eyes questioning. A drop of water ran down her wrist from her dishwashing, but she seemed not to notice. Caleb gently took her hand in his, marveling at how naturally their fingers laced together. Lydia's breath caught, her cheeks flushing pink in the lamplight. He could see the shadow of old fears in her eyes, the expectation of rejection, of being found wanting. But Caleb had never been more certain of anything in his life. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was soft, reverent, not born of passion but of something deeper. It was a seal on the bond that had grown between them, as natural as seeds sprouting in spring soil, an acknowledgement of the precious gift they'd found in each other. When he drew back, Caleb saw tears sliding down Lydia's cheeks. For a moment his heart seized with worry, but then he saw her smile, radiant and wondering, through the tears. Never thought anyone would, she whispered, her voice catching. Never dreamed someone would look at me and see something worth cherishing. You are worth everything, Caleb said firmly, drawing her into his arms. She pressed her face against his chest, her tears dampening his shirt. But these weren't tears of sorrow. They were the release of years of loneliness, of feeling unwanted and unloved. Caleb held her close, his own eyes growing damp. Silently, he offered up thanks to God for this unexpected blessing. He who had resigned himself to solitude, who had thought himself too awkward and plain for love, had been given this precious gift, a heart that matched his own in gentleness and faith. The lamp flickered, casting their joined shadows on the cabin wall. Outside, spring peepers began their evening chorus, and a cool breeze carried the scent of fresh-turned earth through the open window. All around them, new life was stirring, growing, reaching toward the light. And in that simple cabin, two souls who had never dared hope for love found themselves blooming like flowers after a long winter, turning their faces toward the warmth they'd found in each other. Days stretched into weeks as spring settled fully over the mountain homestead. Each morning brought new changes to the garden they had planted together. Tender green shoots pushed through the dark soil, reaching toward the warmth of the sun, Lydia checked their progress daily, kneeling carefully between the rows to pull any weeds that dared threaten their crops. "Look, Caleb," she called one morning, pointing to where the first corn stalks had broken through. "They're coming up strong." Caleb paused in his work, leaning on his axe handle to admire the sight. "You've got a good touch with growing things," he said, watching how she beamed at the praise. The garden wasn't the only thing flourishing. Lydia moved about the cabin with increasing confidence, her natural skills as a homemaker emerging. She had mastered the temperamental wood stove, learning its moods and hot spots. Her biscuits came out golden brown every time now, and she'd started experimenting with different pie fillings using dried fruits from their winter stores. One afternoon, Caleb showed her how to use the butter churn, an old family piece that had sat unused for years. "My mama used to let me help when I was small," he explained, demonstrating the steady rhythm needed. "Gotta keep it smooth and even-like." Lydia took to it quickly, though the work made her arms ache at first. But she persisted, and soon they had fresh butter for their table. The first time she spread her own butter on warm bread, her face glowed with accomplishment. Their days fell into comfortable patterns. Caleb would rise before dawn to check his trap lines, returning to find breakfast waiting. While he worked on repairs around the homestead, Lydia kept the cabin in order, hanging wash on the line and sweeping the rough wooden floors until they gleamed. The barn roof had worried Caleb all winter, its aging shingles threatening to leak. Now he set about replacing them, carefully laying new cedar shakes while Lydia handed them up from below. She worried about him working so high, but he moved with sure-footed confidence born of years in the mountains. "Been meaning to fix this for ages," he called down to her. "Just never seemed worth the trouble when it was just me." Lydia understood what went unsaid, that having someone to care for had given him new purpose. She felt it too, in the way she now mended his shirts with tiny, careful stitches, wanting them to last. Their next trip to town proved less daunting than before. Lydia had baked extra pies, golden apple and rich berry, to share with neighbors. The gesture surprised many who had judged them harshly before. "Why, these are right tasty," Mrs. Peterson admitted, sampling a slice. "You've got quite a touch with pastry, girl." When some young boys started snickering at Lydia's size as she crossed the street, Caleb stepped forward, his usual shyness forgotten. "That's my wife you're disrespecting," he said firmly, his quiet voice carrying clear authority. "She's worth 10 of you put together." The boys scattered, and several onlookers nodded approvingly. Word spread about how the strange mountain man treated his young bride with such gentle courtesy. Gradually, some of the cruel whispers began to fade. One evening, as thunder rumbled in the distance, Caleb sat by the fire working on something small he wouldn't let Lydia see. "What are you making?" she asked, curious about the way he carefully shaped the wood with his knife. "Just wait," he smiled, his shoulders hunched over his work. The storm drew closer, wind rattling the cabin windows. Lydia bustled about, making sure all was secure for the night. When she returned from checking the barn animals, Caleb stood and held out his hand. "Got something for you," he said softly. In his palm lay a wooden hair comb, carved with delicate flowing patterns. Lydia gasped, touching it reverently. "Did you make this for me?" Caleb nodded, suddenly shy again. "Noticed your old one was broken. Thought you might like something pretty to use instead." Tears welled in Lydia's eyes as she took the comb. No one had ever made her something so fine before. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, feeling how each curve had been shaped with care. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Would you help me put it in?" Caleb's large hands trembled slightly as he gathered her thick brown hair, carefully sliding the comb into place. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating their reflection in the window glass. His tall frame bent tenderly over her shorter one, both their faces soft with affection. "There now," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Suits you right proper." Lydia touched the comb again, her smile radiant. "It's the finest gift I've ever had. Thank you, Caleb." They settled by the fire as rain began drumming on the roof. The storm's fury seemed far away from their snug cabin. Lydia had her mending basket beside her, but for once the work lay untouched as they talked. Sometimes I dream about having little ones running around here, Caleb admitted quietly. Never thought I would, being alone so long. But now... I'd like that, Lydia said, her cheeks pink. Though I worry about teaching them proper. My reading ain't what it should be. We could learn together, Caleb suggested. I've got my Bible here and some other books. We could practice every evening. Lydia's face lit up at the idea. You wouldn't mind. Teaching me? Would be my pleasure, he assured her. Though you already know plenty worth knowing. Saw how you showed young Tommy Peterson's wife the right way to make soap last week? You're a natural teacher yourself. Their laughter mingled with the thunder, filling the cabin with warmth. Lydia picked up her sewing again, humming softly as she worked. Caleb added another log to the fire, then settled back in his chair to watch her. These quiet moments felt like pure gift to them both, the simple pleasure of being together, building a life neither had dared hope for. Yet beneath their contentment lay a thread of worry. The court's deadline loomed closer, and still no marriage license had been issued. Mr. Dillard's threat hung over them like storm clouds on the horizon. But for now they had this, their cozy cabin, their growing garden, their deepening love. Each small victory, each shared task, each tender moment wove them more tightly together. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as one. The storm raged on outside while inside, illuminated by firelight and fellowship, a family was taking shape. Not in the way either had expected, but in the way God had chosen for them. Built on foundation of mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared faith in better days to come. The spring morning dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the cabin windows. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching a pair of bluebirds flit between the newly leafed aspens. His thoughts turned to supplies they needed, flour running low, thread for Lydia's mending, maybe some sugar if they could spare the coins. Reckon I ought to ride into town today, he announced over breakfast, watching Lydia serve up the last of their biscuits. Getting short on some necessities. Lydia looked up quickly from her plate. I'll come with you, she said, her voice firm despite the slight tremor in her hands. Been meaning to pick out some fabric myself, if we can manage it. Caleb studied her face, noting the determination in her eyes. These past weeks had brought subtle changes to his young wife. A straightening of her spine, a lift to her chin. Still, town meant facing stares and whispers. You sure? He asked gently. I can manage on my own if you'd rather stay here. No, Lydia shook her head. I won't hide away forever. Besides, she added with a small smile, someone needs to make sure you don't forget the baking soda again. Caleb chuckled, remembering his last shopping trip. Fair enough. We'll take old Bessie. She's steadier than the wagon for your ride. After breakfast, Caleb led the cream-colored mule from the barn, while Lydia changed into her best dress, the blue cotton one she'd carefully altered to fit better. She'd even used the wooden comb he'd carved to arrange her hair neatly. The morning air held the fresh sweetness of spring as they set out, Caleb walking beside the mule while Lydia rode. The trail wound down through stands of pine and flowering dogwood, last year's leaves crackling under their feet. About a mile from town, they met the Petersons heading the other direction in their wagon. Caleb tensed, remembering past sneers, but Mrs. Peterson actually smiled and waved. Why, Lydia, you're looking well, she called out. That mountain air must agree with you. It surely does, ma'am, Lydia replied, her cheeks pink with pleasure at the friendly greeting. The garden's coming along nice, too. You'll have to share your pie recipe with me sometime, Mrs. Peterson said. Haven't tasted better since my own Mother's Day. Mr. Peterson nodded respectfully to Caleb. Saw some fresh bear signs up by Miller's Creek. Might want to check your trap lines there. Much obliged for the word, Caleb replied, touched by this simple act of neighborly consideration. As they continued on, Lydia sat straighter on the mule. They seemed different today, she mused. Kinder-like. Folks can come around given time, Caleb said. Just got to prove ourselves steady and true. The main street was busy when they arrived, Saturday bringing in farmers and ranchers from outlying homesteads. Caleb helped Lydia down from the mule, then tied Bessie to the hitching post outside the mercantile. Inside, the store smelled of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco. Mr. Jenkins, the owner, gave them a neutral nod from behind his counter. Lydia moved purposefully through the aisles, selecting what they needed: a 10-pound sack of flour, baking soda, coffee, and several spools of thread in practical colors. Caleb watched with pride as she confidently conducted their business, counting out coins from the leather purse he'd given her to manage. She'd proven herself an excellent keeper of their modest funds, stretching every penny with careful planning. "Will there be anything else?" Mr. Jenkins asked, wrapping their purchases in brown paper. "No, thank you, sir," Lydia replied politely. "This'll do us fine." They were just stepping out onto the boardwalk, arms full of parcels, when a familiar voice cut through the street noise. "Well now, if it isn't the mountain man and his questionable bride." Mr. Dillard stood before them, elegant in his tailored suit. Behind him loomed Deputy Wilson, his badge catching the morning sun. Caleb instinctively moved closer to Lydia. "We've no business with you today, Dillard." "Oh, but I'm afraid you do." Dillard reached into his coat, producing a sheaf of official-looking papers. "You see, I've discovered some very interesting documents regarding young Lydia here." The deputy stepped forward, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "Best hear him out, Boone." Dillard's smile didn't reach his eyes as he began reading. "This contract, dated last fall, clearly shows that Lydia Parker was bound as an indentured servant to the Western Rail Line, specifically to work in their Silver Creek boarding house. Her stepfather's mark is right here, plain as day." "That's a lie." Lydia's voice shook with anger. "I never agreed to any such thing." "Your agreement wasn't required, my dear," Dillard said smoothly. "As a minor, your guardian's signature was quite sufficient." Caleb's hands clenched into fists. "Those papers are forged and you know it. We'll fight this." "By all means," Dillard smiled again, cold as a snake. "But until a judge rules otherwise, the contract stands. Deputy Wilson here has authority to take her into protective custody." "You're not taking her anywhere," Caleb growled, stepping in front of Lydia. A small crowd had gathered, watching the confrontation with worried faces. Lydia clutched Caleb's arm, trembling but standing her ground. The deputy frowned. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Boone. Let's all stay peaceful here." "Peaceful?" Caleb's voice rose. "There's nothing peaceful about stealing a man's wife with false papers." "Wife?" Dillard laughed. "You still haven't produced a valid marriage license, have you? As far as the law's concerned, she's an unbound minor, and subject to her guardian's contracts." Caleb felt sick, knowing Dillard had them cornered. Without that license, their marriage had no legal standing. He looked at Lydia's pale face and made a quick decision. "We're leaving now," he announced firmly. "If you want to press this, do it proper, through the court." Dillard shrugged. "As you wish, but don't leave town. The judge will want to see you both soon." Keeping himself between Lydia and the deputy, Caleb backed them toward their mule. The crowd parted, many faces showing sympathy but none daring to interfere. "Where are we going?" Lydia whispered as Caleb helped her mount. "Reverend Pike's," he replied grimly. "Time to get some godly counsel on this devil's work." They found the preacher in his study, surrounded by books and papers. His weathered face grew grave as they related what had happened. "Dillard's a schemer right enough," Reverend Pike said, pacing his worn carpet. "Been causing trouble for honest folks ever since the railroad hired him. But these new papers worry me. He's getting bolder." "Can you help us?" Lydia asked quietly. "You know the truth of how I came here." "I'll testify again, surely," the preacher nodded. "Got all the original correspondence right here, showing you were matched proper through the marriage bureau. But..." He hesitated. "But what?" Caleb pressed. "Dillard's got influence in this town, more than folks like to admit. Railroad money talks mighty loud to some people, even those wearing badges and carrying gavels." Lydia's face crumpled. "What are we going to do?" The preacher came and laid a gentle hand on her shoulder. "First thing is, you'll stay here tonight. Martha will make up the spare room. We can't risk Dillard trying anything underhanded in the dark." "He's right," Caleb agreed reluctantly. "We'll be safer here till we can face this proper." That evening, after a quiet supper with the preacher's family, Caleb and Lydia sat together in the parlor. Through the window, they could see stars appearing in the darkening sky. I'm scared, Lydia admitted softly. What if they take me away from you? Caleb took her hand, his rough fingers closing protectively over hers. I won't let that happen. Made you a promise, remember? Before God and everyone. They bowed their heads together, prayers mixing with their fears and hopes. Caleb felt the familiar war inside him, the urge to solve things with his fists fighting against the need to win this battle the right way through law and justice. Lord, he whispered, give us wisdom here. Show us the path through this valley. Lydia's hand tightened in his as she added her own silent prayers. Whatever came next, they would face it together, mountain man and unexpected bride, bound by something stronger than any paper Dillard could forge. The night deepened around the parsonage, crickets singing in the garden. Inside, two hearts beat as one, clinging to faith and each other as they waited for morning and whatever challenges it might bring. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Caleb and Lydia approached. They had risen before dawn at the parsonage, sharing a quiet breakfast of biscuits and coffee with Reverend Pike and his wife. Now, dressed in their best clothes, Caleb in his pressed black coat, Lydia in her blue cotton dress, they paused at the bottom of the steps. Ready? Caleb asked softly, offering his arm. Lydia straightened her shoulders, though her hand trembled as she took his elbow. Ready as I'll ever be. They climbed the worn wooden steps together, their footfalls echoing in the crisp morning air. Behind them, townsfolk were already gathering, drawn by the promise of drama. Whispers followed them into the courthouse. There's that mountain hermit and his fat girl. Heard tell she ain't even of age. Poor thing being fought over like property. The courtroom was filling quickly. Farmers in clean work shirts sat beside merchants in tailored suits. Women in their Sunday best fanned themselves, though the spring morning was cool. At the front, Mr. Dillard lounged in his chair, examining his pocket watch with practiced indifference. Judge Hammond entered, his black robe sweeping behind him. The room rose, then settled into expectant silence as he took his seat behind the heavy oak bench. This court will now examine the matter of Parker versus Boone, the judge announced, his voice carrying to the back corners of the room. Regarding the disputed status of one Lydia Parker. Dillard rose smoothly, adjusting his silk vest. Your Honor, I have here properly executed documents showing that Miss Parker was legally contracted to the Western Rail Line by her stepfather and legal guardian. He approached the bench with a flourish, presenting his papers. As she is a minor, the contract is binding regardless of any subsequent arrangements she may have made. The judge accepted the documents, studying them through his wire-rimmed spectacles. The scratching of his pen seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed courtroom. Mr. Boone? Judge Hammond looked up. Do you wish to make a statement regarding these claims? Caleb stood slowly. His hands were rough from years of hard work, his face weathered by mountain winds. But there was dignity in his bearing as he faced the court. Your Honor, he began, his voice wavering slightly before finding its strength. I reckon I need to speak plain truth here, even if it shames me some. He took a deep breath, conscious of every eye in the room upon him. I've lived alone in these mountains most of my life. Never took a wife, never knew a woman's company. Folks called me the Virgin Hermit, and I reckon that was true enough. Titters rippled through the crowd, but Caleb pressed on. I wrote to that marriage bureau because I was lonely. Wanted a companion, someone to share my days with. When Lydia stepped off that stage, well, she weren't what I expected. Lydia's cheeks flushed red, but Caleb turned to face her, his voice growing stronger. But from that first moment, when others were laughing and pointing, I saw something in her eyes. Something true and brave despite her fear. I offered her my name and protection that day not from duty, but because I saw her worth. He turned back to the judge, shoulders squared. We may not have fancy papers yet, but she's my wife in the eyes of God and by the choice of my heart. I've treated her with nothing but honor, given her my home and my trust. She's proved herself 10 times over. Keeping house, learning frontier ways, facing down every hardship with courage. Tears were streaming down Lydia's face now. She rose to stand beside Caleb, her voice clear despite her emotion. Your Honor, may I speak? The judge nodded, studying her carefully. When my mama died, my stepfather treated me like a burden, called me useless, said no man would ever want me. She lifted her chin. But Caleb, he saw me different. He's taught me to shoot, to tend garden, to believe in myself. He's never spoke one unkind word, never made me feel less than precious. Reverend Pike stood from his place in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may? At the judge's nod, he approached, carrying a leather portfolio. I have here the original correspondence regarding this match, showing it was arranged properly through legitimate channels. Also letters from Lydia's mother before her death, speaking of her daughter's character and age. She is indeed 17, nearly of majority. The judge accepted these documents, comparing them carefully with Dillard's papers. The railroad agent's smirk had faded somewhat as he watched the proceedings. Furthermore, the preacher continued, I can testify to Mr. Boone's character. He's a God-fearing man who's lived honest and upright, if solitary. Since bringing Lydia to his home, he's shown nothing but propriety and respect. They attend services regular, participate in community, and have built what appears to be a genuine and caring marriage. Murmurs filled the courtroom again, but different now, thoughtful, considering. Several of the women were dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Even some of the men who had once mocked Caleb were nodding slowly. Judge Hammond removed his spectacles, polishing them carefully while he studied the couple before him. Caleb stood straight and tall, his arm protective around Lydia's shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, their unity evident in every line of their bodies. This is a complex matter requiring careful consideration, the judge announced finally. There are questions of contract law, guardianship, and marriage statutes to be weighed. I will review all documents and testimonies thoroughly before making my ruling. He fixed Dillard with a stern look. In the meantime, no action is to be taken regarding Mrs. Boone's custody. She will remain with her husband until this court decides otherwise. Is that clear? Dillard's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. Yes, Your Honor. Very well. The judge gathered his papers. This court will reconvene when I have reached my decision. You will all be notified. He struck his gavel once, the sharp crack echoing through the room. As people began filing out, many paused to speak quietly to Caleb and Lydia. Mrs. Peterson, the miller's wife, pressed Lydia's hand warmly. You come by for tea sometime, dear. I'd love to taste that apple pie Reverend Pike's been praising. The blacksmith's gruff voice carried clearly. Reckon that mountain man's proved he's got more honor than most fancy folks. Several others nodded agreement. Caleb and Lydia walked out into the sunshine, still holding hands. The morning had warmed considerably, but the air felt lighter somehow, despite the uncertainty still hanging over them. You spoke well in there, Lydia said softly. Telling the truth like that, even the hard parts. Truth's all I know, Caleb replied, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. Figured it was time everybody heard it plain. They paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps, watching townsfolk disperse to their daily business. Dillard brushed past them without a word, his face dark with frustrated schemes. What do we do now? Lydia asked. We go home, Caleb answered simply. Keep living our life, doing what's right. That's all anyone can do. They walked toward the livery where they'd left their mule, moving together with the easy familiarity of two people who had found their rhythm with each other. The morning's testimony had changed something, not just in the eyes of the town but in themselves. They had declared their truth publicly, stood together before God and everyone. Whatever the judge's eventual ruling, they knew who they were now. Not just a mountain man and his mail-order bride, but partners who had chosen each other, day by day, through all the challenges life had thrown at them. As they mounted up for the ride home, the spring sun warm on their backs, they carried with them the knowledge that they had spoken their hearts openly and honestly. They had nothing left to prove to anyone but themselves. The mountain air felt heavier than usual as Caleb and Lydia made their way back to the cabin after the court hearing. Neither spoke much during the journey, each lost in their own worried thoughts. The mule's steady hoofbeats and creaking leather marked time as they climbed the familiar trail home. When they finally reached the cabin, Caleb helped Lydia down from the wagon with gentle hands. She gave him a wan smile before disappearing inside to remove her good dress. Caleb stood for a moment in the yard, staring at the woodpile as if it had personally offended him. Without a word, he strode to the chopping block, stripped off his court jacket, and seized the axe. The first log split with a satisfying crack. Then another. And another. His powerful strokes sent chips flying as he worked out his frustration on the timber. Inside the cabin, Lydia changed into her work dress and tied on her apron. Her fingers trembled slightly as she measured flour into the wooden bowl. The familiar motions of bread-making usually soothed her, but today her mind kept returning to Mr. Dillard's smirking face and those damning papers he'd presented. She worked the dough with more force than necessary, pushing and folding until her arms ached. Through the window, she could hear the steady thunk of Caleb's axe, faster and harder than his usual measured pace. The sound matched the anxious beating of her heart. The afternoon wore on. Caleb's shirt grew dark with sweat as he attacked log after log, his movements driven by an inner storm. The pile of split wood grew impressively large, but still he couldn't find peace. Every crack of the axe reminded him of the judge's gavel, of how powerless he'd felt in that courtroom despite speaking his heart's truth. Inside, Lydia shaped the bread into loaves and set them to rise near the banked fire. Her movements were automatic, learned from years of kitchen work, but her mind was far away. The judge's words echoed in her head. "This court will reconvene when I have reached my decision." How long would they have to wait? How many days or weeks of uncertainty stretched before them? As dusk approached, Lydia stirred the coals and added wood to the fire. The cabin slowly filled with the homey scent of baking bread. Outside, Caleb finally set down the axe, his arms trembling with exhaustion. He'd split enough wood for 2 winters, but the physical labor hadn't eased the knot of worry in his chest. They came together at the table as darkness fell, the fresh bread and simple stew before them. Neither had much appetite, but they went through the motions of the meal, the silence between them growing heavier with each passing minute. Finally, Lydia set down her spoon. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke. "If they come to take me, don't fight them, please." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You could be killed." Caleb's head snapped up, his gaze intense as he stared at her across the table. For a long moment, he said nothing, just looked at her as if memorizing every feature of her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "I'd rather die than see you treated like property." The words rang with quiet conviction in the cabin's dimness. "You ain't some contract to be bought and sold. You're my wife." Lydia's control broke then, tears spilling down her cheeks. Caleb rose and moved around the table, gathering her into his arms as she cried. Her tears soaked into his shirt as he held her close, one hand gently stroking her hair. "God gave me this duty," he murmured against her hair, "to protect and cherish you. I won't fail in that, no matter what comes." "But I couldn't bear it if something happened to you," she whispered against his chest. "Nothing's going to happen," he assured her, though they both knew it wasn't a promise he could truly make. "We just got to hold on and trust in the Lord's guidance." The days that followed stretched out like molasses in winter. They tried to maintain their normal routines, but the weight of waiting pressed down on them both. Caleb threw himself into projects around the homestead, mending fences that didn't really need fixing, cleaning his rifle repeatedly, anything to keep his hands busy and his mind from dwelling too much on what might come. One morning, watching Lydia struggle with carrying water from the stream, Caleb decided she needed to learn to ride properly. He led the mule into the meadow, where the grass grew thick and soft. "Time you learned to handle old Jake here yourself," he told her. "Might need the skill someday." Lydia eyed the mule nervously. "He's awful tall." "He's steady as a rock," Caleb assured her. "Come here." He showed her how to mount properly, his strong hands supporting her as she settled into the saddle. Jake stood patient and still, ears flicking occasionally as Lydia found her balance. "That's it," Caleb encouraged. "Sit straight and proud. You're doing fine." Over the next few days, he taught her to guide the mule with gentle pressure from her knees, how to hold the reins properly, when to trust Jake's sure-footedness on the mountain trails. Lydia's confidence grew with each lesson, and sometimes she even smiled, really smiled, as she mastered a new skill. In return, she began teaching Caleb some of the domestic arts he'd never bothered to learn in his years of solitude. She showed him how to patch his clothes properly, not just the rough darning he'd always done. Under her guidance, his stitches grew neater, more even. "You've got good hands for detail work," she told him one evening as they sat by the fire, him awkwardly wielding a needle while she worked on her own mending. "Just like with your trap setting." He ducked his head, pleased by the praise but still shy about accepting compliments. "Reckon there's always something new to learn." She also began teaching him to bake, starting with a simple sweetbread her mother had taught her to make. Caleb's first attempt was rather dense, but Lydia praised his effort anyway. By the third try, the bread came out light and fragrant, and the pride in his eyes at her approval warmed her heart. These quiet moments together, learning from each other, sharing skills and stories, helped ease the constant worry that plagued them. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, built on small kindnesses and shared understanding. They moved around each other with increasing ease, anticipating needs, offering comfort without words. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat together by the fire. Lydia had been teaching Caleb to read better from his Bible, but the words had begun to blur as tiredness overtook them both. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls as Lydia's head grew heavy, eventually coming to rest on Caleb's shoulder. He sat very still, hardly daring to breathe as she drifted into sleep. The firelight played across her face, softening her features, and his heart swelled with a fierce protectiveness. Looking down at her peaceful expression, Caleb offered up a silent prayer of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, barely audible above the crackling fire, "for sending her to me, for giving me this chance to prove my worth in your eyes." But even as he gave thanks, dread pressed heavy against his chest. The thought of losing her, of seeing her dragged away to some railroad boarding house, made his throat tight with fear. He'd meant what he said about dying before letting that happen, but the thought of violence turned his stomach. He was a peaceful man by nature, yet he knew he would fight if he had to. Lydia stirred slightly in her sleep, nestling closer to his warmth. Caleb carefully adjusted the quilt around her shoulders, his touch gentle as a father's blessing. He would protect her, this precious gift God had entrusted to his care. Whatever came, he would not fail in this sacred duty. The fire burned low, its light growing dim, but still Caleb sat motionless, holding his sleeping wife and keeping watch through the dark hours. His love for her had grown from duty to choice, from protection to partnership, and he would defend that bond with everything he had. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the night, its lonely song echoing through the mountains. Inside the cabin, Caleb continued his vigil, his determination as solid as the mountains themselves. They would face whatever came together, strengthened by their faith in God and in each other. The rider appeared on a crisp morning, dust trailing behind his horse as he made his way up the mountain path. Caleb met him at the fence line, his heart quickening at the sight of the official-looking envelope. Inside the cabin, Lydia paused in her bread-making, flour dusting her hands as she watched through the window. Caleb's fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. His eyes moved slowly across the page, reading aloud. "Final hearing set 3 days hence, 10 o'clock morning sharp." He looked up at Lydia, who had come to stand in the doorway. Judge Hammond wants to settle this once and for all. Lydia's hands twisted in her apron, her face pale. 3 days, she whispered, a tremor in her voice. Caleb crossed to her in 3 long strides, taking her flour-covered hands in his. "We'll walk in together," he said firmly, "whatever comes. You ain't alone no more." They spent the next days preparing. Caleb brought out his best boots, worn but solid, and polished them until they gleamed. The preacher's wife, having heard the news, arrived with a bolt of pretty calico. Lydia's eyes lit up at the gift, and she worked late into the night, stitching a new dress by lamplight. When the morning arrived, they set out early. Caleb helped Lydia onto the mule, noting how straight she sat now, no longer afraid of the height. The town stirred to life as they approached, storekeepers sweeping porches, women heading to market. Lydia felt the weight of every stare, but Caleb's hand on her arm kept her steady as they dismounted. The courthouse was already filling when they entered. Judge Hammond sat stern-faced at his bench, papers arranged before him. Mr. Dillard lounged near the front, his usual smirk in place. But when Reverend Pike stood to testify, that smirk began to fade. "I verify, under oath before God," the preacher declared, "that this match was arranged honorably, with true intent of marriage." He produced the original letters, his voice firm. "These two souls have proven their commitment through adversity." Dillard surged to his feet, waving new documents. "Your Honor, I have proof of prior claims." "Enough." Judge Hammond's voice cracked like thunder. "Mr. Dillard, these papers bear false seals. You face charges of attempted fraud." The room fell silent. The judge turned to Caleb and Lydia, his expression softening slightly. "By the authority vested in me by this territory, I declare this union lawful and binding. Let no man tear asunder what God has joined." Relief washed over Lydia like a summer rain. Beside her, Caleb released a breath he had been holding for weeks. The crowd, which had once mocked them so cruelly, began to applaud. First a few hesitant hands, then warming to genuine appreciation. Caleb turned to Lydia, lifting her hand to his lips in a gesture that made her blush. In that moment, before all the town, he sealed their victory with a kiss that spoke of devotion deeper than any law could measure. The mountain trail wound silver in the moonlight as Caleb guided their mule homeward. Lydia nestled against his back, her warmth steady and sure. The clip-clop of hooves marked their triumphant journey, while crickets sang in the tall grass and an owl called from deep in the pines. "We did it," Lydia whispered, her voice tender with wonder. Her arms tightened around Caleb's waist, and he covered her hand with his own, rough fingers gentling over her soft ones. The cabin came into view, its window glowing with unexpected lamplight. Caleb tensed for a moment, until familiar voices carried across the yard. Their nearest neighbors, the Hendersons and Wilsons, stood waiting with covered baskets and bright smiles. "Thought you folks might be worn out from all that legal business," Mrs. Henderson called out, her kind face beaming. "We brought some victuals to celebrate proper." Lydia's eyes welled with tears as she climbed down from the mule. Mrs. Wilson wrapped her in a warm embrace, while Mr. Henderson clapped Caleb on the shoulder. Inside, the visitors had already stoked up the fire and set out dishes on the rough-hewn table. The baskets yielded fresh bread, preserved peaches, and a hearty chicken stew that filled the cabin with savory steam. Lydia brought out her own contribution, a berry pie she'd baked the day before. The neighbors praised her cooking with genuine warmth, and color rose in her cheeks at each kind word. "Never tasted better pie crust," Mr. Wilson declared, helping himself to seconds. "You're a blessed man, Caleb." "That I am," Caleb agreed softly, watching his wife move about the cabin with new confidence. This was the first time anyone had visited their home, and Lydia glowed with pride as she served their guests. After the neighbors departed with final congratulations, Caleb and Lydia knelt together before the hearth. The firelight painted everything in warm gold as they bowed their heads in prayer. "Lord," Caleb's voice rumbled low, "we thank you for your mercy and protection, for bringing us through trials to victory, for making us truly one." "Amen," Lydia whispered, her hand tight in his. They remained by the fire, talking softly of dreams now free to take shape. Caleb spoke of adding rooms to the cabin, of a proper kitchen for Lydia, of a nursery someday. Lydia listened, joy spreading warm in her chest as she imagined their future unfolding. When the hour grew late, they didn't separate as they had every night before. Instead, Caleb drew Lydia close, his kiss deep and tender. No more would shame or fear keep them apart. They were husband and wife in truth now, blessed by law and God alike. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, a whip-poor-will called lonely in the dark, but inside the cabin, Caleb and Lydia held each other close. Their hearts beat in quiet harmony, finally at peace in the sanctuary of their love and their covenant. All the loneliness of their past lives melted away in the warmth of belonging to each other at last. Summer painted the mountain meadows in wildflowers, and Caleb's garden burst with life. Neat rows of corn stretched tall while beans climbed their poles, and squash spread wide leaves in the rich soil. Plump chickens scratched between the garden beds, clucking contentedly as they hunted bugs. Inside the cabin, Lydia's clear laugh rang out as Caleb shared tales of his youth, of tracking his first deer, of getting lost in a snowstorm and finding his way home by starlight. She listened eagerly, her hands busy with mending or cooking as he spoke. Each evening, Lydia practiced her reading, finger moving carefully across the Bible's pages. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read, voice growing stronger with each verse. Caleb watched proudly, offering help with the harder words. On Sundays, neighbors gathered in their cabin. Hymns rose sweet and strong as Mrs. Henderson played her squeeze box. Children perched on benches while Lydia taught them to roll pie crust, her face glowing as she guided small hands. In town, folks tipped their hats respectfully now. The same people who had once whispered cruel words now praised the couple's faithful hearts. One golden evening, Caleb presented Lydia with a cradle he had carved from pine, its sides smooth as silk. Tears sparkled in her eyes as she ran her fingers over the loving craftsmanship. "For our future little ones," she whispered, and they stood together watching the sunset paint the mountains in glory, their hearts full of peace. Autumn painted the mountains in blazing colors, setting the forest aflame with red and gold. Inside their snug cabin, Caleb and Lydia sat contentedly by the crackling hearth after their evening meal. The lamp's gentle glow warmed the rough-hewn walls as Lydia placed a fresh-baked loaf on the table, its yeasty aroma filling the air. Caleb bowed his graying head, weathered hands clasped. "Lord, we thank you for this bounty, for this home, for your grace," he prayed softly. Outside, wind whispered through dying leaves, but inside all was peace. Lydia began humming "Amazing Grace," and Caleb's deep voice joined hers, their harmony sweet and sure. Her eyes traced the shelves lined with gleaming preserve jars, winter's store laid by. The rifle that once meant survival now rested quietly above the door. Caleb reached across the worn table, taking her soft hand in his calloused one. "No one is unwanted here," he murmured. Tears of joy sparkled in Lydia's eyes as she squeezed his hand, their hearts bound in faith, love, and the dignity of belonging. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.